Hey everyone, welcome back to the fourth episode of the Pediatric Practice Management video
Yeah.
cast or media cast. I've got Brandon here. Brandon, say hello.
Hey Chip, how's it going?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you in Chicago today?
Very good, very good. Actually working from home, so very relaxed.
I was going to say, because that looks like a nice office otherwise.
Yeah.
Anyway, our topic today is front desks, and we're going to talk about front desks, about performance and expected performance. We had the request to do front desks. Originally, I think we were going to focus on benchmarking, but we're going to expand that a little bit to a few other aspects of it, like not only benchmarking, but how to hire, what you look for, and so forth. And we're going to use both Brandon's experience as in his office, what he does and how he's gotten to what he does, and we're going to use sort of the experiences that I've gathered from practices all over the country to let people know what I've seen work and what I've seen fail as much as possible. Before I start, yep, go ahead.
Benchmarking, I have a love and hate relationship with benchmarking, so I'm actually very interested to see what you have to say about this, Chip. And here's the reason why I have a love and hate relationship. If I'm above the benchmark, then I think it's a great benchmark.
All right.
If it's below, I think it sucks, and I think it's the worst thing ever, and it's useless. So I get both ways. I don't feel very good about it because if I'm above the benchmark, then it gives me a sense of confidence. It overinflates me. So I'm like, oh, we've got this covered, no problem, which I think is a bad thing. It's a dangerous thing. And then if we're under it, we're like, well, that benchmark sucks. That doesn't really work very well. And what do they know about managing a practice? So, interesting about benchmarks. So I want to talk a little bit about that in terms of when benchmarks can help you and when they don't really do very well. Do you think it's something we can talk about a little bit later?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'll just summarize my position. We'll get back to it when we actually hit some of these benchmarks. But I think whenever you are greeted with any kind of practice management benchmark, you have to apply your own situation to it. The example I give to people when I lecture about it is that we know that the average American male weighs 180 pounds. And so if I tell you that I weigh 180 pounds, you have no idea. I wish I weighed 180 pounds, but you have no idea whether or not I'm overweight. If I'm 6'5", or if I'm a bodybuilder, or if I have certain jobs, 180 pounds may not be overweight at all. In fact, it may be underweight. If I weigh 150 pounds, it doesn't mean I'm in great shape.
Right.
It could mean I'm in great shape. It could mean I have a small frame. I'm a runner, whatever the case may be. So when someone presents to me as if I'm a physician, says, oh, I weigh 180 pounds, you have to take everything else into context. And so you have to put the context of your practice into place. And when we hit some of these benchmarks, I think some of that will become pretty obvious.
Yeah. I think that's important because oftentimes I see people, and even me, I mean, I include myself into that, relying a lot on benchmarks. We want to know what is the benchmark, what are the better practices doing out there, and like you said, it doesn't necessarily just because you're not in that, in that ballpark, let's go say, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing bad. So I do want to talk about something that I do in order to kind of overcome that uncertainty or that feeling that I have. So I want to, once we get into it, I'm going to show you what we do in our practice to kind of overcome that benchmark when I don't like the benchmarks that I'm looking at. But
all right, that's good because these, I will say, the front desk benchmarks are a little different from some of the other benchmarks I normally do. I mean, when I talk about an E&M distribution, okay, we can be pretty straightforward about that. If you're outside those curves, you better have a pretty good reason. Let me restate that. You can be outside those curves pretty often, but with some of the benchmarks I have today, maybe I'll challenge you. We'll see what we get to. I would like to thank our SOAPM friends, however, today, because I posted last night, you saw it, I know, a request for questions and things that we want to cover today, and I got a lot more replies than I expected, a lot more material, which is great. I don't think we're going to be able to cover it all today. We'll do our best, and we'll fly through things, but I really appreciate that input, and I'm hoping that people will start asking, not only in the SOAPM list, but on the Google community. The link is at the beginning of the video and at the podcast. That people will send us email, requesting topics that we can cover. If you send us a good one, we'll do it. I mean, absolutely. So thank you to SOAPM because they filled out my notes today.
Yeah, that was
Guaranteeing.
great. That was great. That was a little bit. I was like, ooh, this is a lot to talk about. So we'll see if we can do our best with all
Yeah,
that.
Brandon and I are conscious of trying to keep these to. We try to keep to 30 minutes. We've yet to do it. It's 45 every time. And if I didn't have a clock on the top of my computer screen, we could go for 2 hours. We're not
Absolutely.
going to do that, but here we go. So let's talk split into two things. There are two things I want to talk about with the front desk. There are the objective measures, which we'll frame as being the benchmarks right now. What do you expect for performance from your front desk, and how do you affect that performance? And then there's what I would call the subjective performance, which is the part that has to do that's harder to measure. Their ability to make your customers, your patients, feel happy and welcomed. And I think those two things are very important. We have to discuss them both. So let's give 10 or 15 minutes right now about the objective measures.
The
The,
objective.
yeah,
Objective. Okay.
the objective one. So the first one, I'm going to ask you, Brandon. Let's start here. What do you do to measure the performance of your front desk? What's important to you? How do you measure it, and how do you get them to change their behavior? And then I'll come in with what I've seen in some real numbers.
Well, I'm going to be very honest here, and I guess we're talking about objectivity, and I measure it very subjectively.
Yep. Okay.
To be quite honest. We are trying to get better at measuring these sort of things. I keep really an eye on it, and I look at the list of the people that owe money or have a co-payment, and the expectations are already set that these need to be collected. So that's basically kind of what I do. I kind of eyeball it, and I see if things aren't, we're not doing collections very well at the front desk, and I start asking, why is that? But really, what I do most, I think that if I had to put it on what I do most, is the training aspect of it, and setting the expectations from the staff. And this kind of falls into the subjective aspect of it, but I have worked tirelessly and for years to build a culture of collection in our office. And I think that has gone a long ways in our office, because the expectation is that co-payments have to, there is no question that the co-payment doesn't get collected. And it hasn't been easy, because the people that we generally get for the front desk are not necessarily collectors. They're front desk people. But we've done a lot of training and a lot of discussions on why the collections at the front desk is very important. And I have a huge list of things, but just summary is there's a lot of money that it's like we discussed a little bit earlier. It's a great, it's a barrier. It's a great place to have the collection discussion, because the expectation is that I'm not going to get treated unless I pay, and that may or may not be the case depending on the circumstances. But that moment right there is really one of the few shots that we have to collect. So what I do, again, just to reiterate, is the culture of collection has to be embedded, has to be baked into the organization. So that's what I do, and then of course there's other things that we look at. To see, well, it's very easy to say, well, we were supposed to collect, I don't know, let's say $500-600 today, and we only collected $300. Why is that? And I look at that because every day I get a daily log sheet of everything that was collected, and I can easily take a look at. The other thing that we do is work, and I think that you are going to mention this, but we do some stuff beforehand. So we take a look at the accounts of the people that are coming in. So we look maybe a week or two out in advance, and then we just kind of move every 2 weeks. We move forward, and if I see people that have, and this is something that I do, and then I've been training my new kind of billing supervisor to do it as well, to take a look to the future. Let's take a look at the accounts, and then go ahead and put pop-ups. Because oftentimes, if the biller is not present, or my front desk billing kind of specialist is not present, then the nurse checks them in because it's lunchtime. Half of the staff went away, but the nurse is checking somebody in. Then they just check them in. We see them, they're gone, and then it's like, hey, I had to talk to this person. So the pop-ups are very important. So as soon as somebody checks in, there's a pop-up that shows up. This person needs to, we need to discuss the billing issues with this person. So either the nurse will say, okay, wait 1 second. If she can't handle it, we have to go call somebody. So that's a good way to kind of ensure that people don't move through the system without this aspect working on. So I got a few more things, but I want to turn it over to you and not dominate the conversation.
Well, everything you said is right in line with what we like to teach people about collecting their money. There's no excuse not to collect a copay. It's 2013. Everyone has a decent billing system by now, I hope, and those billing systems should tell you, what someone's outstanding balance is, what their financial status is. One of the tricks that a number of our clients use is to, when they identify in advance of the day those people who do owe the money or do have a financial circumstance, they bring them to the exam room, and before the doctor goes in that exam room, the office manager walks right in there and says, how are we going to fix this balance today? How are we going to settle this issue? How are you going to pay? There's not if you're going to pay. It's not when you're going to pay. It's the expectation is now, and how do you want to do it? Do you want to give me cash? Do you want to give me a credit card? Just as an aside, and we should make this clear, neither you or I are really focusing on those families who can't pay. Neither you or I are suggesting that we deny anyone care or anything like that, because we work for pediatricians. It's just not an option. That's not how one of my clients thinks. It's not how I think. It's not how you or your practice think. We're talking about the people who owe you money and just don't feel like paying. And those people drive me crazy. So what we do, or what we encourage people to do, is just like you do. You prepare in advance for any given day, regardless of your walk-in percentage. On any given day, you are going to be pulling some charts for the day, and you should be making sure that you have a financial understanding of those patients coming in. And anybody who owes you money you need to make sure to collect that money before they leave. And let me show you an example of one thing that we do. This is a small, simple one. Okay, this is not. I'm looking solely at one thing, and this is one benchmark. It's one benchmark I'll give you. That's the collection rate, and I'm going to pull this up on the screen because we can do this in a video cast, and maybe I'll throw this report up or a sample of it on for the people who listen on the podcast. Right. But what I want to share right now with you is an example of a report that you can run with our system, and this isn't just our system. There's nothing special about this. This is from a practice, okay? And what we have is the copay collection rate. And what it does is goes day by day by day. So I'm looking right here at 12/13/2012, all right, the third line down. I'm just picking it at random. On that day, this practice had $330 worth of copays walk in the front door. $305 was collected on those copays for a collection rate of 92.42%. And
okay.
Then does that make sense?
Yeah. So let's for the benefit of those that aren't looking at this. So we have 4 columns. Yep. One, we have the first column. We have a transaction date. So I'm assuming those are the dates of the date of service, correct?
Yep, that's correct.
So then we have a column that says copayment. So that's so it has the total amount of money that is expected to collect.
Yep.
We can say that, okay. And then the next column says amount of copayment paid. So that's what actually happened, right?
Correct.
And then of course we have the ratio. So let's just look at the very first day. We have 12/11 of 2012. The expected copayments collected for that day is $140. And this practice actually collected $140 for a collection ratio of 100%, right?
Correct.
Okay. So what else can you tell me about this report?
Well, if you run it whenever you're looking at benchmarks, if you look at an individual day or you have a small sample, you get a sample size problem. And we, whoops, I'm going to get back to this. We don't encourage just looking at a day. I like looking at a month or 2 months or whatever the case may be. And what I see from PCC clients is a collection rate on copays alone that it hovers between 90 and 100%. We obviously have clients who have a 50% collection rate of copays, but 95% is what I see in our typical practices. And I'll tell you this, when I get phone calls from practices who have financial challenges, who are having trouble with their bills and so forth, I routinely see, if I'll run a report that says, show me the balances of the people who came in today, the balance at the end of the visit, what walked out your door, and it's usually measured in the thousands of dollars. Not on any individual day, but over the course of a week or course of 2 or 3 weeks. And so you can combine a copay report with an outstanding balance report or whatever the case may be and actually measure. You should be able to do this even with any billing system. You should be able to measure what the balances were walking out your door. And personally, when I see practices that dip below a 90% collection rate on their copays, that throws a red flag. Is it a big deal? Maybe not. Over the course of a month, that might be $1,000 if you're at 70% or 60%. But that tells me that there are people who come in who had copays and the copay wasn't collected. And I would turn to you and Brandon and say, is there ever a time when that's really acceptable anymore?
No.
Okay, so there you go. So yes, maybe 1 out of 20 really did forget a checkbook. I'm guilty of it myself, or okay, it happens. But 1 out of 20 is a 95% collection rate. So if you have someone who's in the 70s, that means on any given day, 70%. If you had 30 kids in that day, you had a handful of people who walked out with not one, not two, but you had 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 who walked out without paying their copay.
Yeah,
that's a lot. And
I'll bring something else that also is a little bit about with the subjective portion is the inconsistency, which actually is detrimental.
Yeah.
Because what happens is when you have a practice that is consistent with their copayments, the patients are walking in, they got their credit card out already because they know the expectation is that they have to pay. So you almost rely less on the staff because the patients are trained, essentially. So when you're even just a little bit consistent, then the patient's going to come in next time and the first thing they're going to say, well, I wasn't nobody collected a copayment last time. Why am I being collected? Can't you just bill me? And that's awful because it just disrupts the practice. It just disrupts the practice.
That just costs you $5 or $10.
Well,
right?
And time and effort and discussions that you just simply do not need to have.
Actually, you know what, Brandon? I will say that you just hit one of the benefits of doing these discussions, because in all my thinking about this, I haven't bumped into the inconsistency issue, and it's the sort of thing that only comes up when 2 people actually speak.
Yeah.
The inconsistency part is great. Let me pull that back up again because I want to show you something. All right. I nuked it. Sorry, it's gone. When anyone who's on the podcast or you'll get. I'll throw it up on the screen for people. But you'll see that on some days at this random practice, okay, there was a 100% collection rate, and on some days there was a 50% collection rate.
Yeah.
What I would do if I ran that practice, I would see if there was a consistent staff.
That's the first thing that occurred to me was there had to be some sort of a staffing issue or something. Like also who was working the front desk, because as much as there's a built-in culture, the nurse is not the best person to collect because that's just not simply her job, right?
Exactly.
And she will open me here and there, but she's not going to be discussing with the patient. So, and sometimes in my office, I'll admit, if half of the staff goes on lunch and the nurse says, oh, don't problem, we only have a couple of patients, I'll stick around because we don't close for lunch, by the way. So, but the half of the staff does go away. Then I would see if maybe perhaps those 2 or 3 patients came in right at that lunch, so that would be something that we'd have to take a look at. I want to go back to one more thing about, because I know that this was brought up with the discussion, sorry, not the discussion, but the questions that we, or the petition that we made for people to make suggestions on SOPM was about the hiring of the front desk staff. I think that without question, if the person is not anybody that works the front desk, if they are absolutely not comfortable with asking for money, then they are disqualified for the position right then and there. That's one of the first questions that are you uncomfortable with asking for money? And if it's like, yeah, I am, then it's like, I don't care how good you are, because you're not going to be we'll find something else for you, but you can't work the front desk. And in fact, right now we are looking for a front desk person, and I found a person that used to be a collector, like an actual collector, on the phone calling people day after day. And I'm like, that jumped out with a resume, and I called her immediately. I want to talk to you. Right. Now with her, I had to be very careful that she had the customer service aspect of it, and she wasn't just like in your face. But so we're I'm kind of working that out. But that's something that I wanted to add there in terms of the consistency and then the culture of collection. It has to be embedded into the organization all throughout.
Brandon, I couldn't agree more. And I'm beginning to think that you and I should take Ritalin before we do these things, because now you've got me thinking about 10 or 15 things I want to talk about.
But before you jump into that, then I want to talk about because you put that benchmarking that practice up there, and I want to I mentioned at the beginning that I was very, I had a love and hate relationships with benchmarking. So what I've done, and this is the part that I wanted to tell you, what we've done, is that I think that we often rely so much on the other benchmarking, and we don't take a look inward in terms of what our practice looks like. So what I've been doing from time to time, and I haven't done this with the front desk, but now, that report that you have, I do have available to me. And I never really used it that much. We implemented it a while back, and it just kind of fell by the wayside. We started doing other things, so I'm going to jump back on there. But I want to show you what we do in terms of like accounts receivables, for example. And I'll use that as an example on how we benchmark ourselves. So let me see if I can pull up here something that I do that I think is very important. And the reason why I do this is because I kind of mentioned at the beginning that oftentimes we try to rely on what others are doing, but we don't take a really good look at where we're at. And so when you look at a benchmark and it's not quite what you think it should be, or you're below, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing bad. But I think it's important to go and dig in to identify and have a better understanding on why it is that you are below. Maybe for you, you are doing very well, and I think your example about the weight is actually, it actually fits very well. So this is what I do when I don't like the benchmarks that I see out in the world. I go about, so I did here a little bit of an intro here. I did a presentation a while ago, so I'm going to bring up my slides so you guys have a good idea on what I talked about and then kind of how I go about doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here. Okay. And we have a PowerPoint slide. Let's see if this works. All right. So I'm assuming you can see one that says revenue leaks, practical guide on how to prevent them. Yep. So I'm going to go really fast on this presentation, Chip.
We should just let everyone know who's listening to the podcast that we'll put these slides up right in the podcast, so you'll be able to see them no problem.
So one of the things that I think about collections, and this is really about benchmarking too, is that you have to be very intentional about it. It doesn't just simply happen. Right, so if you're going to improve your collections, if you're going to improve your co-payments, if you're going to improve your front desk, you have to be very intentional about it and think it through with some objective and be with a purpose. So that's one of the things that is very important. That I think it's kind of simple and it's almost silly bringing it up, but oftentimes we need to be reminded more than to be instructed. So that's why I like to start out mentioning that it has to be with intent and with purpose. And this is basically what I'm talking about here. Here's another slide that says avoiding revenue leaks has to be done with intention and with purpose. All right. So the very first thing is that we need to be able to set some goals. So how do we do that? Well, there's a quote that we've seen out a lot on the web. It says you can't improve what you can't measure. Right. So we first have to start looking at what to measure. Now the truth is, Chip, that you can really measure whatever you want. So there's nothing specifically that I recommend, just as long as you start to measure something. And there's a really quick acronym that you can remember, which is called the SMART acronym, and it's each letter represents something. So S is for specific, M is for measurable, A is for attainable, R is for relevant, and then it's time bound. So I'll give you an example on how this works. And the example that I use is accounts receivable. So this is something, the way that I would do it in my practice, and in fact I've done it. So the first thing that I would do is probably grab that report that you showed just a while ago as a good example and take a snapshot of what the practice looks like today. And the reference that I used in my presentation, it's you've been to these big, let's go say Disney, and you need to go from point A to point B, but oftentimes you need to find a map to find out where you are in the park, because that way will determine, identifying where you are will determine if you have to go left and you have to go right. So that's kind of the same way. You have to take a look at the snapshot of the organization, of your whatever it is that you're measuring, and then decide where do you want to go from there. So for the purposes of this explanation, and you can do it also for your front desk, I'm going to say the number one step is take a snapshot of your accounts receivable, or take a snapshot of your collection front desk co-payment collection ratios, or whatever the case you want to do. So using that SMART acronym, we're going to create a goal. So the goal is reduce 90-day past due accounts by 25%. Now that practice, I think, had that you showed the numbers. They were at they were at 89%. I think 89.13. So for example, we can say, okay, the practice today is collecting co-payments at 89%. We want to make that 95% like you said that that is a good benchmark to have.
Yep.
So it's important to set a time frame. That's part of the SMART goal. It's important to set a time frame because otherwise, then it gives you a sense of urgency if you put the time frame. So here's my kind of my statement, which is reduce 90-day past due accounts receivable by 25% by March 30th, 2013. Now, in the case of the report that you brought up, you can say I'm going to increase it by by 5% or 6% to reach that 95% benchmark by, I don't know, a month or two. The next thing is you have to brainstorm action items for team members. So in the case of my example of accounts receivables, we're going to send out collection letters. We're going to follow up with a phone call. We're going to work the denied claim bins. In the case of the example that you gave, we perhaps can do training. If in fact it was a problem that staffing was an issue, then obviously that's something that needs to be addressed. So now we create an action plan in terms of what we're going to do in order to meet that goal. The next thing that I do in the practice is that I assign specific action items to the team members. And oftentimes what I do is I also set a SMART goal for them as well. So for example, if I'm going to assign somebody to send out letters for collections, then I say, hey, I need you to send at least 100 letters by the end of the week. So you're going to do 25 each or 20 a day, whatever the case might be, that's up to you. But at the end of the week, you need to have sent at least 100 letters. Again, I assign specific action items to team members. That's number 5. And then number 6 in my how to set your own benchmark, I rinse and repeat. So after 2 months, if we didn't meet the goal, then we have to do it again. If we did meet the goal, we can decide whether to improve that one, or if perhaps we want to jump onto something else. So what do you think about that, Chip?
I think that's great. I think that's what I would do is I would pick a very specific measure, just as you said, as it relates to measuring your front desk, and zero in on it. The SMART acronym is one that we've used here at PCC forever. I would certainly encourage it. There's nothing worse than putting a measure into place that you can't actually measure, or you can't actually improve on, or you make it unattainable. One of the implications of the SMART acronym that I think leads into one set of the front desk questions that we had has to do with motivating your front desk staff to actually do their jobs. I was speaking with someone at length yesterday about how her practice struggles sometimes with her front desk people. Just some of them are really good, and some of them just don't really want to work very hard. And I get that kind of comment from our customers every day. And I think it was Dr. Marconi on SOAPM actually asked some really good questions about how do you identify the people during your interviews who are going to be motivated, and how do you keep them motivated? Since we're following different pathways, before I get back to the benchmarks, let me toss a couple things out there that I've seen work well that don't fully answer any one of these questions, but are some things for people to think about. The first thing is it relates to hiring. I think that's the single hardest thing someone who runs a pediatric practice can do, if it's just to find and hire good people. That is the single biggest challenge. Sometimes you are pleasantly surprised by your employees. Sometimes you are unpleasantly surprised by them. I do think, however, good front desk people are born and not made. I think, yes, you can improve people. I think that there are things you can do. There's standards you can have in your practice. There's a culture you can promote in your practice. But at the end of the day, I don't think you can turn someone who isn't customer-oriented into someone who isn't into someone who is. Maybe there are some ways you can do that. I mean, we can all see the Pike's Place fish video, and PCC is a service company. We have service discussions every day, all the time. But at the end of the day, if you are not someone who is good at greeting people, if you're not someone who's both courteous and friendly, I think Bud Shankin made that distinction online. I think it was a great one. If you don't have that, if that's not part of your normal person, it's never going to be part of your normal person. And I don't want those people working at the front desk. Yeah. So
So really quick, do you have maybe just 2 or 3 suggestions on how? I have one, but I
Yep.
wanted to ask you on how do you identify if the person is born with the skill set as opposed to made?
All right, that's a good question. That's hard to do. I'll tell you what PCC does, because PCC, we have a whole raft of support people, and they have to answer the phone, and they have to greet our customers just like you greet yours. It's very, very similar process. And there are a couple things that we do. In the end, I'll describe one that I don't think will work for you or any of the practices listening, but it will give you an idea of the sort of thing you can
Well,
do.
then don't give it.
No, no, it's the reason
I'm
is
going to give you a great one. It's not going to work for you, but I'm going to still give it to you.
It's an example. You want to take this one and apply it to yourselves. One of the reason it won't work, Brandon, necessarily is because sometimes we hire 3 or 4 people at a time, and most of our practices don't do that. So when we do that, like let's say we have 5 or 6 candidates for 1 or 2 spots, and we want to pick the best candidate. So one thing that PCC's done in the past, maybe you could do this, is we actually have, this sounds super nerdy, but it's incredibly effective, is we'll have an ice cream social. We will literally invite the 4 or 5 candidates to PCC, and we'll put out all the makings for ice cream sundaes. Everyone from at PCC, we just get a call that says, hey, at 2 o'clock, ice cream social, and everyone goes down and makes ice cream sundaes. You can tell in about 3 minutes who's going to work well at PCC at that social, because they're talking to people, or they are friendly, or they're outgoing.
Yeah.
Now, you don't have to have an ice cream social with your practice. It could be a good idea, but engaging them socially is what really goes a long way. Although I'm sure there would be exceptions, I find it hard to believe that someone who isn't engaging with you and your rest of your staff socially is going to be good at the front desk.
All right, well, I have an idea, and actually I'm going to steal this one from Lynn Kramer. And for those of you that don't know, Lynn Kramer manages a very, very successful practice in Pennsylvania, Chip. I'm not sure exactly.
Eden Park, Pennsylvania.
Eden Park Pediatrics. And she had a great suggestion that kind of is along the lines that you mentioned. Having a social hour perhaps is not conducive in our environment. Yeah. But one thing that I think is that could help is actually leaving the person at the front desk for for a morning or the entire day, and what that will do is you see the interaction of that person. You see the interact. Are we on? Are we still on?
Yeah, we're still very much on.
Sorry. So seeing how they interact with the staff, and I think that the question what I would look for is the question that person is asking while they're working and they're shadowing somebody else. So you put them in the environment, and oftentimes somebody will come up and the first one that they're shadowing is doing something else. See how they interact. Or they sit there frozen and just not like try to blend in and like if they had camouflage so they won't get noticed. Or they jump up and say, hey, somebody will be with you in one moment or something. I think that would be a good idea to just basically kind of, to some extent, do what what you're suggesting, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's, Brandon, I think that's an excellent idea. I mean, the bottom line is...
We've never done that before, and Lynn brought it up, and I was just like, man, why haven't I thought of that? So I'm going to start doing it because I'm actually hiring the front desk person, and I'm being so cautious. It's funny because now with my repurposing of how I'm going about doing this, there have been so many candidates that I would have hired that have come through my desk that a few years ago I would have hired like that. And now because we're older and wiser and we have a different perspective, which is something that I want to probably going to bring up in another podcast in terms of the culture and how to go about hiring and things like that. But my way to kind of identify those people is with, and this is something not that I made it up. I mean, you talk to any HR person and they'll tell you this, but give them situational questions. So maybe all of us have had very unusual circumstances happen where we just say, hey, so this is the scenario. A mom comes in, she's very upset, she has a balance and has a very high balance, but her kid has a fever. The mom has been in already 2 or 3 times. We haven't been able to figure out what's wrong with the kid. The mom's frustrated, everybody's frustrated. What would you do at that moment? And then just have them, have them talk. And I think that if you have a few situational interview questions, that will help you. Maybe that person is really good at answering questions. Usually they're not. Usually people are, just answer the best way they can. But
Yep.
I think that that's a very good way to identify, how people are doing. Hey, Chip, I'm actually running out. I'm going to run really quick. I'm actually running out of juice here. So if you want to continue on for the benefit of our, and I hate
Yeah,
to.
go get your plug. Get your plug. As much as I like the concept of using situational questions in interviews, the one problem with that I find is that people don't necessarily behave in interviews the way that they behave in real life. I've been in many interviews where a kid. I'm thinking about doing it for Boy Scouts for when they do their Boy Scout work. Sorry about that. I interview. I've been in these interviews, and people will give you answers that you want to hear. And so, although I feel like you have to ask those questions, I don't put as much stock in them in those questions as I put in the interchanges that we have that aren't official. All right. So when I sit down with someone and I make it clear that we're asking these questions or that questions, that's great. It's what they say and do when the camera's not on. Yeah. That's really important. I really like the idea of running someone out in the position itself. I mean, let's state this officially. Your front desk staff is so incredibly important.
Oh, man.
I mean, they can kill a practice. I've worked with practices. I mean, one of the things I have to do for a living is visit and call pediatric practices. I promise you, I have visited and called more pediatric practices than anyone who will ever listen to this, all right? And I decide whether or not we're going to work with someone from the front desk staff all the time. And if I'm doing it, you know your patients are doing it, and you know how you feel when you are met by good front desk staff versus bad front desk staff. It happens all the time. So hiring that right person, making sure that you get an extrovert, not an introvert, someone who is excited to meet someone who is energized by answering the phone and talking to someone else. That's vital. So you and I both agree on this. We'll state that as just our position. The other thing I would ask, or I would encourage people is, I'm a simple fan of hiring bright people. And,
of course, you wouldn't want to hire dumb people. What kind of a statement is that?
Well, I find sometimes that people pay a lot of attention to experience, which, don't get me wrong, of course, just like you said, you found someone who worked in collections, she jumped right to the front of your list. I would totally agree. But I probably, in the scope of things, put less weight on someone's previous experience and more weight on my subjective judgment of their, I don't want to call it their IQ, I don't even call it their education, because those aren't necessarily the measures that I want to use.
I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I often tell people that, people in interviews, I say, or even when I talk to the staff, I can't teach people to be nice. I can't teach people to smile. Right. I can teach them how to collect a copayment. I can teach them to post a payment, but I cannot teach them to smile. That's something that comes from it. So I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah.
So the front desk people are born. You can then make the good ones into great ones. Yeah. But you can't make a bad one into a good one. I think you and I agree on that wholeheartedly.
Let me jump in one additional, because I had the situational interview. One thing that we're doing, and this is kind of, I keep on referring to the next podcast that we may do about the culture, but one thing that we've been doing, we started with this front desk position, and we haven't gotten to it yet, but what we have planned is doing these personality assessment tests. Yep. So with the Myers-Briggs or the DISC, whatever one you want to use. And we actually did it for ourselves. We all did it. And the doctors, I did it, the staff did it. And it was awesome. It was absolutely awesome. And what happens is that you really do identify a lot of personality traits, characteristics. And what we've done is several things. One is we've identified gaps in our culture and in our practice. So we have to make a decision whether we want to hire somebody that fits really well with us, or do we want somebody that's going to balance us. So that's one thing that we're looking at now that we're hiring this front desk person. And then the other thing is that you really get a good idea on what personality is. So if you, like, we have one person that, for example, is very very type A, very focused, doesn't tolerate, less than perfect and all this other stuff.
That would not be you.
No, 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 that is not me. Absolutely. So it's interesting because, that person might be really anal about many things, but in the interview they're going to come in like, I'm very flexible,
Exactly.
I'm cool, all my coworkers in the past love me, but it's like, well, wait a minute, your personality assessment here says that you're actually very bent out of shape about certain things. So I would encourage people to take a look into that, whether the Myers-Briggs, I mean, there's tons out there. And that's another way to really start, and that's how I'm starting to identify people where we need to. And in fact, we're also doing repurposing people, repositioning people as a result of our Myers-Briggs, and we did the Myers-Briggs and the DISC assessment. We are repurposing people depending now, because now we know their strengths and we also know their weaknesses.
Right. We should take your results and your process there, and let's do that for our culture pass, because I'm really interested in that, and I am a believer. I wasn't at first, but I am a believer in some of these tests because they're just markers, they're guides, and so I like that. I want to hear what you ended up with. We'll do that on the next one, I think.
Yeah.
So let me back up for a second.
Let's go to benchmarking. Let's go back to the benchmark, because we talked a lot about hiring, subjective, and stuff like that. So let me
give you some other things that I very much encourage people to measure, and I'll give you some sense of how to do it. 2 or 3 other categories of things that I think must be measured. You really must be. So we've talked about, well, first of all, we've talked about copays and outstanding balances. I'm going to go on record as saying that as a rule of thumb, I like to see 95% of all copays collected, and depending on your practice, I do like to see 70, 80, 90% of outstanding balances collected. Yes,
I was going to ask you about that, yeah.
A family who shows up with a $1,500 balance because they're a young family, they can't pay, they've got an HDHP, you're not going to collect $1,500 to do that 1 month well check. I don't mean that. But if someone owes you money, you need to be collecting it, and if you're not, you need to have reasons. But that's one. The other thing that I see done shockingly poorly by many practices is checking eligibility. Most of the listeners out there should have eligibility software to do a lot of this work. Let me use our clients. I'll pick on our clients. PCC clients have, I mean, depending on where they are, but it varies, but the overwhelming majority of our clients have free eligibility checking for the majority of their patients. They don't have to do anything. Yeah. They're done in a batch in advance, and then when someone's standing in front of them with any of the major payers, United, Aetna, whatever, you tap a button and there it is. Even our customers don't do it well. And so what I look in, and so is it any surprise that 3 weeks later they might find out that that patient wasn't actually covered at that time? That is such a huge waste of time and resources. Now, at the flip side, we have clients who not only use our eligibility checking, but additionally call in every single one of them and go to every website. We have people at both ends of the spectrum. So there's my camera, both ends. I am a firm believer that at the very, very least, every single person who has an automated or instant eligibility check should be checked, and that also, at the very least, 100% of your kids who are getting well visits should have their eligibility checked. There are exceptions for this. There are parts of the country where you can't really do eligibility checking, automated or even online. I understand that, but Brandon, where you are in Chicago, if I call into your practice and I look at your day-to-day, I should see that eligibility has been done on all your major payers. Now, there's one other, or maybe 2 or 3 other quick categories, and let me tell you how to, let me hit the categories, let me describe them, and then let me tell you how to measure them regardless of what vendor you have, okay? Lynn Kramer actually sent me this one, and this is what was right at the top of my list. She sent me a list of the things that she actually measures her staff on. She measures her staff on what I call the PCMH, or meaningful use demographic data. How many people have updated their race, their language, their ethnicity? How many people have updated their emergency contact? How many people have information for their phone numbers? Right now, in 2013, if someone from your office, a patient visiting your practice, walks out and has not indicated their preferred emergency contact, and hasn't given you given you cell phone numbers and home phone numbers and stuff like that, you've missed an opportunity. If they've walked out and they have not, if they haven't signed your financial agreement in the last year, if they have not signed up for your portal, if they haven't indicated that you can text them, okay, these are all things, like you said at the beginning, not only is collections best when someone's standing in front of you, so are all these other administrative tasks. So what you can do, all right, make your list. You've got PCMH, a meaningful use demographic information. You've got you've got insurance eligibility. You've got phone numbers. You've got addresses. You've got financial policies, HIPAA stuff being signed. All right, there's one last section I'll say for a second. All of those things, you should be able to, at the end of every day, your system ought to have a report that says, make a list for me of everyone who came in today, and I want to see their data in here for that stuff. So if you run a list today, Brandon, of everyone who came in, or like, you know, today's Thursday, so you run a report for Wednesday, show me a list of everyone who doesn't have an emergency contact updated. Show me a list of everyone who doesn't have their HIPAA form signed or their financial policy signed in the last year. You should have, you should approach a 100% rate of success for that. There's no excuse for someone visiting your practice, not having signed a new financial policy, you know, if they haven't updated, not giving you their emergency information. There just isn't. Yes, okay, if someone had an emergency, they showed up at your office, the ambulance showed up, they went to the ER, great, I'm not worried about that. They had a 6-month-old well visit, they had an ear infection, you don't have a reason. And do you disagree?
What if, I mean, that is awesome, and if you have a software that can give you that data, but I don't think that we could have done that in our previous practice management system to know. I mean,
you know what? I bet you could, and here's how to do it.
Without doing a customized report. I mean, that's something that may be a customized report, but I don't know if we would have been able to do it other than going into every single, you know, every single patient and then checking off everything there. I mean, that there wouldn't be no automated way to find out what your your ratio would be.
Right. Yeah. What I'm looking at here is I don't think there are many systems that will give you an do your count for you, do your ratios for you. And in a way, like you know, as you were pointing out with the benchmark, it doesn't really matter what your benchmark is. What really matters is someone walked out without getting their emergency information. All right. What you should be able to do with most vendors at this point is, even with a custom report, say, give me a list of every kid who had an appointment yesterday and show me what we have listed for their emergency contact. You should be able to do that with most vendors. And if you can't, that's another problem. But
yeah,
don't worry about that.
What I would recommend those practices, because I'm sure there's practices out there that either have an old system and or no, well, I doubt they don't have a system at all, but maybe there is. I don't know. But what I would do then, because people always like practical examples, right? So what I would do is create an Excel sheet that has all the name of the patients of that day, and at the very top say address, telephone number, willing to text, race, ethnicity, blah 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 blah, everything else, and then go down and maybe not just do spot checks, right? So just say my last 2 or 3 days. Go down the list and do a check mark. So the demographic, yes, 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 yes. Ethnicity, yes, yes, no, yes, no, no, yes, yes, and so forth. And then that way, and then a few months later, go back, do it again, and then try to kind of do your own benchmark. And that's kind of what I was suggesting. So don't get discouraged if your system doesn't do that, because my guess is that even if it does it, it will require you to call support and ask somebody to do that report for you, or they don't even know where that report is located, and that, so I don't want people to get overwhelmed and say, oh, that's just too much work, I don't want to do it. Although what I'm proposing is a lot of work too, but it's not like
I think people should be squeezing their vendors, including us, as much as possible all the time.
Not all vendors are as receptive though, so that's kind of my point.
All the more reason to yell. All right, but here are the last 2 categories. I thought these were really interesting. One, we are going to save for a podcast or for a cast of our own. Okay, I'm only going to mention it. We're not going to discuss it at length. And that is, I want to know the percentage of patients who walk out your door with their next appointment date.
Whoa.
All right, I love this one. I've had so many arguments, and you know what? I've never lost one yet about this anyway. That's because I haven't had to argue with my wife probably because I lose those. But the I am a firm believer that you should be able to schedule your patients out for everything all the time. I have too many practices who do it. So that's one item, and we're going to save that for another time.
Right. I'm very interested in that one because I think that we need some help on that one.
Okay, and then the other one I like is what I would call patient sort of a practice management demographic assessment, or that's a bad way to discuss it. Anyway, I got this great suggestion, and I know clients who do this. How about tracking every day for the people who come in, how many of them are new patients, how many of them have transferred? And here's why. It's easy. It should be easy with most billing systems to run a report and say, how many new patients did I have last month? Okay, there are a variety of ways to do it. You can just count up your new visit codes, all right? But when someone comes to you and they're a new patient, that is your opportunity to ask them, where did you come from and why? And you need to, as a practice manager, you need to get your staff to ask that question. So what I want to do, what I want a practice to do is, I pretend I'm right here. I'm at your front desk. Brandon, you come in, you say, hi, I'm transferring from so-and-so. My staff should be immediately keyed in to say, okay, so you're transferring from where? So why are you coming to us now? You know, we're delighted that you're here. Tell us why. That information, that strategic information is so vital to what makes your practice good. But I would bet 90% of the people listening right now, their staff doesn't ask that question. All right. So that's a key one. I would want to have, in my ideal fantasy practice, okay, I would want to be able to run a report at the end of the week that showed I had 5 transfers and 8 new patients this week. I want to see 13 reports from my staff telling me where these patients came from. How did you find us? You know, what made you switch? What are you looking for? Now, maybe you'll cover most of this in prenatals and stuff like that, but if you don't know where your patients are coming from and where they're going, you're in trouble. Disagree? Agree.
Well, I don't necessarily think that you're in trouble because I don't necessarily know 100%, and I don't consider myself in trouble.
I'm talking about ideally. It might ideal, but you do.
But I mean, I cannot. That is marketing 101, as a matter of fact, and they teach you in marketing that you need to find out what's working and that's working. And in fact, companies, and some people don't know this, but for every ad they put out, they have a different 1-800 number, and so they look at how many people called their 1-800 number and identify what ad worked best.
Sure.
So that's kind of how they overcome that issue of not having to ask. They have a pool of 1-800 numbers that the company has, and then they just use them and they rotate them and stuff like that. The web has gotten much better at that because now you know where people are coming from. They know how they search for you and things like that. But when you have the phone calls, it's so important. And oftentimes I actually do that not as well. I don't document or anything like that. It's more anecdotal. I just ask, hey, just start asking for me so I get an idea. So if I have run any type of advertising, I always ask, how did you hear about us? How did you hear about us? But I don't document it, and I don't, follow up on it. I just kind of know, oh, the ad is working or it's not working. Right. But just very loosely though.
But this is a good example. I'm going to guess right now that the overwhelming majority of practices don't have a formal process for tracking. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be flawless. But if you had a process at your front desk where you tracked how many new patients came in today, and they knew once it's a new patient to simply ask, how did you find out about us and why did you choose us?
Yep.
That would be a huge improvement.
No, absolutely. I absolutely agree.
I have one more question to ask, I think, and then we'll wrap it up today. And I want to ask your opinion first. What is your opinion, and or how do you use perks and incentives for your front desk? Do you use them at all?
I just did it recently.
Okay.
And I was very. I did not like any type of incentives or any type of encouragement that had to do with money or with an extra day off or whatever. And here's why. my thought was that it's their job. And so I shouldn't have to pay them extra to do something that was already expected of them. So I was very adamant. It's almost like I remember one time we had another doctor that hadn't passed the board, and I was talking to another guy and says, well, why don't you offer her an incentive? If she passes the board, she's going to get money. And I'm like, you're supposed to. It's like, can I get an award for taking care of my kids? You're supposed to take care of your kids. You know, it's just like, so I was always against that. But I just said, let's try it. Let's try it. And again, I want to give another shout out to Lynn Kramer, because she was the one that she does this a lot. And I wanted to increase the well child visits in our office. So I said, hey, I'm going to pay you guys, I don't know what it was, $1, $2, $3. I wanted to make it sufficient so it wouldn't be like, well, here's your 50 cents. You know, I wanted to make something that'd be meaningful. So, and the funny thing is that the staff didn't believe me. I was like, listen, I'm going to pay you cash money if you go out and do these things. And I wasn't worried about the investment. It never was the investment, because $2, $3, $4. I mean, if I'm going to get, you know, several well child visits, I mean, it just washes. That's not a big deal. So I wasn't hung up about that, but I was hung up on just the principle of it. And I got a bunch of well child visits. And when I came, I actually went to the bank and I had everybody up with, I paid them with singles. And I had something like $200 worth of singles, and I said, here's your $45, here's your $10, here's your $15. And then it was funny because the staff was started like, well, I called and I left an appointment, and that person called back later, and so got the appointment, and so should we split it? Can we split it? And I'm like, and then I said, listen, I'm going to throw it back to you guys. You guys decide how you want to do it. And then they said, no, it's credit for it. If you left a message and the person called back, then you lost out. And it actually worked very, very well. So so my opinion is that I think I'm going to start doing it more for 2013, because it worked out very well for us. And another like, for example, here I'll throw something else. The VEP machine. We have a VEP, you know, that's I don't even visually otoscope. I always forget what and it's part of our thing. It's part of our protocol. The doctors need it done, and we just cannot get the darn staff to do them. It's like, what happened? They left. Oh, the machine didn't turn. There was always like a million excuses. And so that's one of the things that I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to pay $1 or $2 or whatever number I come up with to do this thing, because not only is it good for patient, it just happens to pay very well. So anyways, so that's kind of my thought.
This is what I'll tell you. My opinion, I think for a while, has sort of matched the place that you've landed, which is we can sit here and say all day long that we have high expectations of our employees, and you know, we need them to do their jobs, but you can't fight human nature. The fact of the matter is, no one is going to be as interested in your practice as you are, right? Because it's your practice, or as your wife, or as any one of the physicians listening to this cast, because this is their livelihood. This is what they do, and they also, you know, you enjoy. Let's not forget, you enjoy, although you have all the pressure and all the rewards, you also enjoy sort of a flexibility of your day-to-day routine, that if you're the person answering the phones and at the front desk, that's a rough job. And a human brain can only do that job without a change of environment or inspiration for so long. I mean, or there are exceptional people who can do it forever, but I mean, Brandon, how long would you and I last at the front desk position? All right, 3 days before I tased somebody. Yeah. So I don't mind at all having incentives or rewards for people working the front desk in those jobs. My only concern, and I think you would have the same thing, is that it's not something that becomes a substantial part of their actual income. You don't want to incentivize the front desk so 20 or 30% or 40% of their income is based on their performance. You're not advocating that, and I want to make clear that I don't advocate for that. You did it, I think, exactly the right way, which is it's some pocket money. It's a nice bonus. It lets them go get a lunch, and it becomes a competition. Now, Lynn is a big fan of the competition, and I've had a practice actually. We had a very, very, very successful. We have a very successful practice out on the West Coast that paid its staff a big bonus based on collection at the time of service. They actually gave the person who collected the highest percentage of the money at the time of service on a monthly basis. So you collected 99% of the money that was standing in front of you before you left, you got like a $250 gift certificate. And you can't believe the competition to collect. These people are pre-collecting for visits that haven't happened yet, all right? And that's the kind of problem you want to have in your office.
Yeah.
And so, you can't incentivize your front desk that way, but creating that culture, creating the culture who works as a team to do what's best for the practice, that's great. I talked to a client yesterday, not a client, I talked to a practice yesterday who just instilled in the practice the fun committee, all right? The doctor did this to divest of the effort, all right? So she didn't want to have to keep coming up with fun things for the staff and stuff like that because she didn't always know what they wanted. She did what you did, Brandon, which is really great. She put it back on the staff and said, okay, I tell you what, I have certain performance, I'm adding to this discussion quite a bit. This isn't exactly quite what happened, but I have certain things and certain measures that I want to hit. You guys hit this, and we can celebrate in a way that works for you. So she didn't have to guess, like, who wants a gift card from here, who wants a gift card from there. She could go to one of the responsible members and say, here's your budget. You guys meet these things, you can do whatever the heck you want. You can go to Dave and Buster's. We can have a party here in the office, something that makes it fun. And not only did it mean this doctor didn't have to do all the planning and make all the effort herself, which could whiff sometimes, but she's guaranteed that it'll be something that the practice wants. But in the end, if it's something that's a nice team building thing, if the end result is that you come together as a group,
it's camaraderie. It just builds more culture, more camaraderie.
Yeah.
Tip, there was a great unintended consequence with that experiment that I did with incentivizing the staff. Is that there was a few of the staff members that blew out of the water the other ones. And so my first thing was, what were you doing that the other ones weren't? So I sat down with that person and I'm like, how was it? Because by the way, I printed up a list of everybody that was due for a well visit, and everybody got the same amount of call, the same amount of people, I should say. So one did almost like, not only did they put the people on the list, they also did follow-ups for the siblings, and they said, do those count too? I'm like, absolutely. So even if they weren't on the list, if the sibling got in and everybody else also needed, that counted too. And she did awesome. I mean, I think she made something out of 100 calls that she made. She made something like 45 appointments.
That's awesome.
I know. And the other ones, there was other people that only made.
God, that's a fortune.
I know. They weren't all on the list, but there were siblings, right? So
yeah, who cares? But 40. Let's just wait. I just want to pause for a second. Put this in perspective. You generate at least $200 from each of those well visits on average. I know your practice, okay?
Yeah.
45 visits, $200, $9,000.
That's right.
$9,000 and a full schedule, and good medicine. All right, and in those 45 visits, I guarantee in those 45 visits, your doctor spotted something that needed to be taken care of. So you just did this amazing thing, and how much did that cost you?
Like 45. Well, it cost me like, I don't know, 200 something for all of it, but for her it was like $45 because I think I paid her like $1 an appointment.
That's the best investment you've ever made. and the thing is, I'm harping on this because I agree and sympathize with the feeling that you shouldn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But at the end, who cares? $45, 45 well visits?
Well, that's why at the very end, that's what I said, who cares? Because when I did it, it was amazing. But what I want to get back to my point was that I had to sit down with that employee, and I'm like, what was it? And then, she was just kind of walking it through, and there wasn't anything special about how she was portraying it, but I think it had to do with her demeanor. So even though the other people were saying those same words, like, hey, we're calling to remind you that little Timmy is due for a well visit, I think it all had to do with just how her demeanor, essentially, I don't know how else to put it, just kind of her set of her minds. How do you say it? Like her.
She's a salesperson. Let's just
Yeah, she was just her demeanor was entirely different because I talked to the other ones and I'm like, what happened? I left appointments for everybody and nobody wanted to make an appointment. And I'm like, well, what did you tell them? Well, I told them that they were, but I don't know what it was. So I wasn't able to pinpoint in terms of like one person used different words than the other. So what eventually after talking to that person was just the disposition that they had when they made the call. They were in a much better frame of mind than the other ones were. The other ones, by the way, they didn't. Again, I don't think they believed me that I was going to pay them the money. So they were like, oh, because I've asked them to do this many times. And it's like, hey, these people need to come in, and then that's it. I mean, it's like, oh, thank you, and I leave, and then I leave it at that. So they were like, well, this is just one of the other times that Brandon is asking us to do something. And by the way, they did that on a time that we were not busy at all. So it was a way not only so icing on the cake is that it's even more because they were using their time wisely. How much better can they have used their time?
All right. So let's put this in a practical framework, okay? So and then we can wrap up. So anyone who's still listening hasn't passed out yet.
Yeah, that's very.
You could take any one of the benchmarks that we've discussed. Now I'm going to pick an easy one, okay? Copay collection. Mm-hmm. And you can analyze your existing copay collection over the last 30 days. And let's say that you've done 70%. I'm making this all up as I go along. So you should have collected $1,000 over the last month, and you collected $700. So that's $300 that walked out. And as a practical matter, that you probably only going to collect $200 to $250 of that $300. I mean, that's a fact. Okay. Once that money walks, there it goes. So what you could do is you could say, you know what, guys, you could say this to yourself. All right, I know that I have $300 that walk that I'd rather have. I know that that probably cost me $50 in collections and maybe additional overhead to actually bill for that. So you can say this. You can say, you know what, guys, I'm making this up. I'm going to have a company-wide contest. We're at a 70% collection rate right now. Every month that we maintain a collection rate of our copays of 80%, I'm going to buy you lunch. If you're at 90%, okay, I'm going to buy you lunch twice that month, and so on. I'm making up the numbers.
Yeah.
All right, so at the end of the day, you're like, you could get to 90%. It'll cost you 2 office lunches, what's that, Brandon, $50, $75? I don't know. It depends on the size of your practice, So for the same amount of money that you saved, you actually collect the money, reduce your effort, and your staff is happier because they have lunches.
Yeah.
And they're going to be better about it. And now, your mileage may vary. Assign that to yourself. It doesn't matter. But that's the sort of thing. Monetize one of these benchmarks. Find out what it's worth for you and see what happens. And perform an experiment just like you did. I think that's a great idea.
Right. So, Chip, I think we've gone a little bit too long here, but I I wrote some notes here in terms of some takeaways for me.
Yep, go for it.
And then you can complete that so we can finish up. So the first thing in terms of collection, whether it's collecting your accounts receivable, your front desk collection, or whatever the case might be, I think that in my view, there needs to be a culture of collection. The staff needs to understand that here's another story that I've often talked about that I didn't mention it today, but it isn't my money, it isn't the doctor's money, it's also their money because their paycheck comes from that copayment. So it's very important to understand that a broke doctor doesn't do anybody any good. So that's why that culture has to be embedded, that payment has to be expected, and they can't be ashamed of asking for money, for the money that we've already worked for or going to be working for. The next takeaway for me is benchmarking in terms of I love benchmarking and I hate benchmarking. I already talked about that, but I think that it's important to do your own benchmarking and understand your own numbers, and I described on what the steps that I take in order to identify that using the SMART goal system. In terms of identifying who is the right person for the front desk, this is becoming much more of a difficult task, and I kind of anticipate it's not a surprise, but I'm kind of affirming the fact that it's a difficult task, is that this person has to be, the people that work in the front desk have to be exceptional people. And one way that I do this, there's many ways. One way that I do this is doing situational type interviews. I also look for character traits, and one of the tools that I use in order to identify a character trait, or I'm starting to use rather, is doing what do you call them? Personality assessment tests, like Myers-Briggs or the DISC or whatever the other one. The other takeaway that I'm going to start doing that I really don't do right now is eligibility checks. I'm going to really start focusing on those things, particularly with the well visits. And then this one's, I think it's a great idea. I'm just having a hard time thinking on how I have to think about this one, but this is the meaningful use data, or the PCMH data, in terms of the demographic, making sure that we have that information. We do it right now, but I don't think that we have a very good way to measure it and to make sure that we are doing it. Let's see. The next appointment date, well, I'm looking forward to that one. That's the topic that we're going to be talking about. And then the how did you hear about us? I'm going to be looking into how we can incorporate that into our demographic screen and somehow prompt people, and when I say people, I mean my staff, to ask that question so we can start recording it from now on. So that's something that I'm going to be benchmarking here pretty soon, and perhaps in the future I can talk about what are our results. So that's what I have on my notes here. What about you, Chip?
I got 3 easy ones. You ready? I think no matter how much training and preparation and capability you have, the bottom line is I think the best front desk people are born and not made. They can be improved, but they can't be created. I think it is perfectly okay, and in fact sometimes desirable, to use incentives or encouragement for anyone in your staff, but your front desk staff, to get them to perform better. However, it is not okay to have, as much as you need incentives, you need a minimum standard. It is not okay to have patients walk out of your office with unpaid copay or uncollected balances or demographic stuff not completed. I never approve of that. So those are my 3 big takeaways. If we didn't get to your question, I'll be glad to address it on the SOAPM list. I think we covered about 90% of it. And our next episode, we're going to talk about culture in your practice. We'll go back to some hardcore number and data stuff after that, but we're going to talk about how to create a productive, friendly culture in your practice, one that benefits not only your patients but the practice itself. Brandon, anything else before we sign off today?
I think that's pretty much it. This has been great. A lot of great topics, a lot of discussion. I hope people enjoy it as much as we enjoyed it recording it.
Thank you, and we'll see everyone soon. Talk to you soon. Bye.